When you mentioned the Mexico Olympics, one of the problems that came up there politically was the boycott of South Africa because of the apartheid policies of its government, which, of course, many other countries in the world oppose. Now, both of the rugby internationals that we've just talked to have personal experience of this particular problem. Hugo O'Neill decided on his own behalf not to go on the Irish tour of South Africa, which took place in 1980, for this very reason. On the other hand, Hugh Davis has said that for the coming English tour of South Africa, which is scheduled for May of next year, 1984, he will go and play in South Africa if he is selected. Again, both of their views seem to differ widely on this question of whether sportsmen should play in South Africa, and this was another question that we put to them.
I felt that it was wrong to play against South Africa because whereas although one would like to keep politics out of sport, it seemed to me that the difference with South Africa to other countries was that completely on the basis of colour, it determined what you could do within that country. And it seemed to me, from talking to South African people and others, that sport, and in particular rugby, was used as a means of justifying that kind of particular philosophy.
It worked as a kind of propaganda weapon for the government,
yes,
or on the government's side. Do you regret not going there?
No, I don't regret it at the time. Even since, I think, if anything, I more confirmed my decision, because since coming to Oxford, I've met an awful lot of South Africans and talking to them about the situation there. And at first I was a little bit kind of awkward approaching them, knowing that I hadn't gone to their country, but surprisingly enough, most of them who had kind of general views on the situation that I would have sympathy with had said that it was the correct decision not to go.
Hugh, England has a tour of South Africa planned for May of next year, I believe, and you've told me that you'll go if you're selected for the tour. So your attitude to the problem of playing in South Africa is different from Hugo's?
Yes, it is slightly different. You know, I think it's the view of a lot of rugby players that they will play rugby against no matter who, in no matter what country. And I think there does appear to be a lot of sort of dual thinking on the problem of South Africa. You'll have a lot of pressures will be brought towards this decision, particularly politically. And there seems, as I say, there appears to be dual standards in that firms can go and trade with South Africa. Many things are happening there, but no pressure are brought towards those people. But if you're a sportsman, it's suddenly decided that pressure will be borne, you won't be able to do those things. And I think, particularly rugby, they feel if they want to play against somebody, they will. And it sort of smacks of dictatorship to a certain extent, where a government comes along and says to rugby players, there's no way you can play in that country, but there are ways in which our businessmen can trade there.
Well, Alan, what do you think of these two opinions, to participate or not participate in sporting events in South Africa?
Peggy, I'm idealistic enough, perhaps naive is a better word, naive enough to think that the ideals of sport still do have a meaning, politics or no politics. I think that contacts at an individual level of sporting events may help to make government positions more flexible. After all, fairness and equal opportunity are precisely the values we're condemning the South African government for not holding, and those same values of fairness and equal opportunity are values which are important in sport. I think that it would be a great shame if we prevented contacts at an individual level, at a sporting level, which could, in the long run, very gradually, very slowly, help to change the government's attitude. But to leave political considerations for a moment, get back to what we were talking about earlier, which are the commercial and big business pressures on sportsmen. It occurs to me that one of the Olympic ideals traditionally has been that all the participants should be amateurs, that they should not be subject to sponsorship and government sponsorship, big business sponsorship, and so on. Now, the question arises how you define what an amateur is, because as we've seen, sports have become big business, and this line drawn between the amateur and the professional has become very, very diffuse. I think we have some film which illustrates this, but that line has become so diffuse that, for example, the International Olympic Committee in 1974, shortly before Montreal, decided to eliminate the word amateur altogether from their regulations, and I think this is something that we need to think about. This is Saburo Takeuchi, who is former president of the Japan Amateur Athletic Federation, and here are his views on amateurism.
頼らざるを得ないということが実情じゃないですか。アマチュア問題とこの問題とは全然異質な問題で、アマチュアリズムというのは本来、競技者が考えるべき問題で、競技団体が運営の方法についてアマチュアリズムというものはないんじゃないだろうか、そういうことはもう全然違う次元の話じゃないだろうかと私は考えるんですがね。だから
Well, Peggy, I confess to being an idealist. It looks to me as though Mr. Takeuchi is an idealist too. He seems to be saying that really what we mean by amateurism concerns an individual player's approach to his sport. If he can approach the sport with amateur ideals in the forefront of his mind, then those ideals can continue to prosper.
But of course, more and more companies are sponsoring sporting events. We see their names on the names of sporting events, like these pamphlets.
Well, the pamphlets that are on the screen now, we can see very clearly that the companies who have sponsored these events are making a great deal of capital, not only perhaps in the sense of finance, but in the sense of reputation for themselves, simply out of having their name shown so often in connection with the sports.
Certainly, it's important that companies get their names before the public. And one of the ways they do that is to put up these advertisements in playing fields and gymnasiums and on players' uniforms.
And on players' uniforms. So you've got a situation where whether the player wants to protect his amateur status or not, simply by going out onto the field and playing in front of the television camera, quite often, he is, whether he likes it or not, unconsciously representing a sponsor's standpoint, and he can't help that. So I wonder whether this definition between amateur and professional is useful any longer, whether even in the context of the Olympics we can continue to make that a useful distinction. Well, we talked also to Mr. Paulin of the International Amateur Athletic Federation, and in a sense he summed up the athlete's problem as regards amateurism.
The performances are now so high that all the athletes that will take part in the big meetings have to train many more hours per day, and they can't do their job and train. So something must be done about that. And so the athletes try to get money in an illegal way outside of the rules. We think we have to do something about that.
And of course, something was done about this problem. Last year, in 1982, the International Amateur Athletic Federation decided to allow amateurs to receive prize money, for example. Also, different national athletic organizations have set up a more open system where athletes receiving money for sponsoring projects can use that money for living expenses and training expenses, so long as the money goes through those athletic organizations.
It seems to be an attempt anyway to strike a balance between idealism and reality, and we can't get away from reality.
To be open and above board.
Right, well, we've been talking to two rugby players, and in many ways rugby is the sport in which players have traditionally jealously guarded this amateur status. It's sometimes called the last of all amateur sports. And because we had the opportunity to interview two international rugby players, I asked Hugh Davis about this question of amateurism in his sport.
There is at the moment a movement for a professional World Cup involving about 8 rugby teams. And
Professional Rugby World Cup.
Yeah. And to a certain extent, this season could be the sort of make or break whether rugby does remain a fully amateur sport, which I think most rugby players are very proud of, or whether it will become a sort of professional at the top level.
Yeah, if that World Cup rugby system was introduced, what effect do you think that would have on individual players? I mean, in what sense would it undermine their own attitude to the game, or alter their own attitude to the game?
Well, I think at the moment, I mean, rugby is played to a certain extent for fun, and that is perhaps the great enjoyment of it. But once you introduce the element of money, then I think people's attitudes change, and they don't have the same ideals. You know, winning is you're playing for money as opposed for yourself and your teammates.
As Hugh Davis said, when money is introduced to a sport, then the amateur attitude, the joy of the game, the fun is lost. Another problem, of course, when the stakes become so high that winning becomes the end of all sporting activity, is that athletes turn to drugs, for example, in a way to make sure that they win. And young athletes are particularly vulnerable to destroying their health in order to win at any cost.
Well, of course, the question of winning at any cost rather than playing a fair game, and as Hugh Davis talked about, having fun playing the game, this is sometimes said, again, in reference to the amateur-professional problem. It's sometimes said that even in the Olympics, the participants from Eastern Bloc countries are, in effect, full-time athletes. Whether you choose to call them amateurs or professionals, is beside the point. They are subsidized wholly by a government which hopes that their winning performances will reflect on a particular style of political system. And so again, we come back really to the problem of politics. Peggy, I think one of the things perhaps we've touched on in today's program is that all of these pressures, the pressures of big business, the pressures that you mentioned, the pressure to win, whether it's a social or political or commercial pressure, as it affects the individual athlete, forcing him to take drugs or whatever, all of these are related. They're pressures which affect a sportsman from outside his sport. They're pressures which prevent him from having fun, from doing his best in the sport which he is trained to do. And whether we feel that these are pressures which can be avoided, or whether we feel that these are pressures that in our own complex political, unfortunately realistic world we have to put up with, those are questions that we'll leave you to think about until we see you in a month's time. It's goodbye from us.
Goodbye.